He grew up in Fort Wayne. He went for his undergrad. He went to your enemy, Taylor University. Do we play Taylor in all our sports or just some of our sports? Do they have a football team? Does Taylor have a football team? What?
I thought St. Francis is the one.
Yeah, maybe St. Francis is a bigger rival. St. Francis, Fort Wayne. Anyway, when he went on to grad school at Harvard, he studied Genesis. So that's why I've invited him to come. He's a believer. He reads the Bible to get fed, knowing it's God's Word. You go to an Episcopalian church right now, is that right? So he goes, would you call yourself an Episcopalian right now?
I'm a member.
He's a member of an Episcopalian church. Okay, so just so you know where he is on the map, so to speak. He's married, he has a wife and 3 kids. They live in Taylor. They live at Taylor because his wife is a resident director at Taylor. And every day, 5 days a week, he has to drive to Huntington University. You know where that is? Kind of. How long does that take you?
45 minutes.
45-minute drive. He drives there and works at Huntington University where he teaches. So today he had to drive down from Upland, from Taylor. Okay, so please welcome him and
thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I met your professor, Dr. Reasoner, a few years ago. We were on an airplane to go to a conference. We always go to this conference called Society of Good Literature. And I think maybe we recognize each other from the bags that we were carrying and say the name of this conference that we went to. We're both trying to make it to Texas, to San Antonio. We had some flight trouble, and so we sort of bonded over that and were able to get to know each other. And we have been corresponding and actually having some meetings down here in Indianapolis to talk about Scripture, to talk about Bible, and we're meeting with another mutual friend and get together and have a good time. So anyway, Dr. Reason has been a good friend of mine now for the last few years, and it's a pleasure to get to be here with you. Yeah, I did my doctoral research on Hagar and Ishmael in particular. I wrote about Hagar and Ishmael, and I think that they're really important and maybe sort of overlooked in the Bible and the story about Abraham. Religion and biblical studies in general, they participate in the broad category of academia that we call the humanities. Okay, and the humanities are different from the sciences, the hard sciences, chemistry and math and physics and so on, because we don't really know things for certain in the same way that we do in the sciences. We can't run experiments or tests, here in Indianapolis and also in, Berlin or in Rio de Janeiro or something and have the same results every single time. We're trying to deal with the data as best we can, trying to interpret texts and passages and read them in light of the historical situation. But we're trying to account for the data. We're trying to find out what explanation gives us the best accounting for the data as we see them in front of us. And so anyway, to bring it back to Hagar and Ishmael, one important datum is just the raw amount of material that there is in the Bible on Hagar and Ishmael. They take up a lot of copy in the stories of Genesis and the stories of Abraham. There's a lot that is there about Hagar and Ishmael, their situation in the Abraham story. So that's something that I'm interested in. I'm trying to figure out why does Genesis care so much about Hagar and Ishmael, especially if they're not really the main part of the story. The main part of the story is Abraham and his son Isaac and the covenant that God makes with Abraham and Isaac. Then why does Ishmael get circumcised? And circumcision is the sign of the covenant. Why does God make these promises to Ishmael to become a great nation if he's not really the focal point? Those are some of the questions I'm trying to raise. I want to start, so I'm going to circle around to those questions, I think, maybe toward the end. You stopped at 1:40?
Yeah.
Or at whatever point they start throwing tomatoes, that's the end of it.
No, we have to stop at 1:45 as the end of class.
Okay. So you don't have to go home, but you can't stay either at 1:45 minutes. Yeah, anyway, so we'll circle around with some of those questions again a little later. But I thought we'd start with talking about source criticism a little bit. My understanding is that you guys have already talked about maybe a little bit or read about source criticism, maybe in Collins and Harris. So you've been introduced to the notion of source criticism a little. I'll say a few more things. Is that, you can see that?
You want it, or maybe make it darker, we'll see.
Better. So these are my own notes. You're not intended to see that at all anyway. This is the main image that I want you to be able to see. And this is the next slide. So this is coming. This is by way of preview. So focus here on Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza. These guys lived in the 16th century. And they are important for the study of the Bible in general, Spinoza and Hobbes, because they are the heirs of the Renaissance, Spinoza and Hobbes, and they're the ones who really give us, for the first time, the idea that the Bible should be treated like any other book. The Bible should be read, should be studied with assumptions that you would make about other great works of literature, Homer or Cicero or Marcus Aurelius or whatever. For the first time, they're saying not only is the Bible written, does it come from the finger of God as divine revelation, but also it's clear that there's a human imprint in Scripture. Hobbes and Spinoza especially are the ones who bring this up in the 17th century. So they start us on this journey. These are the assumptions that they share, that the Bible is to be studied in the same critical manner as any other book, as I just said. They say that the Bible has a history of composition. This is pretty radical. This is a new idea in the 17th century, that the Bible has a history of composition. Up until then, the Bible is thought to come from the mouth of God to Moses or whoever the biblical author is, fairly directly. But Spinoza and Hobbes are saying, no, the Bible has this history of composition, and it's the product of centuries of writing and rewriting and being reshaped and fashioned. The notion that the Pentateuch has authorship that is not simply explained by Moses. Right? Moses traditionally is the person who's thought to have authored the Bible, or excuse me, has thought to have been authored the Pentateuch or the Torah, and they're casting some doubts. They have some suspicions that maybe Moses is not the person who is responsible for Torah or Pentateuch. They say that human authors also play a role in the Bible. Okay? This is the thing that starts us on our trajectory toward modern biblical scholarship, really. Spinoza and Hobbes. So these are a few of the ideas that they have that lead us in this direction. Or I should say a few of the observations that Hobbes and others like him in his time. They notice, for example, that in Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, it says, at that time the Canaanites were in the land. And then, so the observation they have is that if the author is observing, or if the author is saying that the Canaanites were in the land at that time, then whoever is writing this must experience the land of Canaan as not having Canaanites in the land at that moment. In other words, this was written after the events that it purports to be describing. Does that make sense? Right? So this suggests that Moses is not the author. Right? That's their observation. They also say they also see that in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, Moses is described as the most humble man. Okay, and Spinoza and others say, well, if Moses really is the most humble man, then he probably couldn't say that about himself. Right? What kind of a humble person describes himself or herself as the most humble? Right? All right, Numbers 21:14 cites the book of the wars of Yahweh. And so they say, look, even within the Torah itself, it acknowledges that it depends on other sources. This is not just coming from the mouth of God. Clearly, whoever wrote this is also depending on external separate sources, such as the book of the wars of Yahweh. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1 says that Moses spoke these words, quote, beyond the Jordan. And if, from the perspective of the author of this text, Moses is speaking beyond the Jordan, then it stands to reason that from the vantage point of the author, they're on the other side of the Jordan. If they're speaking of Moses saying this on the other side of the Jordan, then whoever's writing it must be on this side of the Jordan. Does that stand to reason? Does that make sense? Moses doesn't go across the Jordan according to the story.
Is there still like evidence of that Moses could have still written the Pentateuch?
Is there evidence that he could still have written it? There are arguments that Moses could still have written it. If that's what you're asking. Yeah, sure. That's the strongest argument I think is that that's the long-standing tradition. Jesus in the Gospels refers to the Torah as the book of Moses. People say this. Oh, well, if Jesus said that this is the book of Moses, then coming out of the mouth of Jesus. Anyway, Deuteronomy 34:5 also speaks of the death of Moses, which would be another thing that would be difficult for Moses himself to write about. Okay, Richard Simon. He's a French priest from the 17th century. He's sort of following on the heels of Spinoza and Hobbes. And he writes this Histoire critique du New Testament, and he says that the Protestant insistence on sola scriptura, right? He's writing on the heels of the Protestant Reformation. He says this insistence on sola scriptura, the Bible as the only source of authority, is problematic. There are other sources of authority that need to be acknowledged, and especially in light of some of the observations about Mosaic authorship. He notices that there are repetitions in Genesis 1 and 2, things that are described in Genesis 1 in terms of there being a creation. Happens again in Genesis 2. There's another account of creation. So there are repetitions. Others nowadays call them doublets. There are instances in which one story from the Pentateuch is repeated elsewhere. Right? For our purposes today, there's an Abrahamic Covenant in Genesis 15, followed by another Abrahamic Covenant in Genesis 17. Why are there two separate covenants? This is what Simon is asking. He notices that there are differences in style. Some parts of the Torah are written in a certain voice, and other parts of the Pentateuch are written in another voice, in a different kind of style. So his conclusion, Simon, is that the Pentateuch must be a compilation. It must be composite of different sources that have been put together. Okay, ultimately this gives rise to source criticism you've read about already a little bit. It's also known as higher criticism. Source criticism is the attempt to identify the sources of the Pentateuch. What were the sources, and what was the relationship of the sources to each other, and how did all this come to be in the first place? Those are the questions that source critics ask. The German scholars who really were practicing source criticism so much refer to this as higher criticism, because for them this is the aim that really is worthwhile. This is the scholarly question, the question of sources. This is the one that should occupy our attention for these Germans of the 18th, 19th centuries. Refer to it as higher criticism, as distinguished from what they call lower criticism, which is this relatively rote discipline of understanding what was the original text of the Bible in their original manuscripts. That's another discipline for another time to describe. Anyway, that source criticism comes into play, especially 18th, 19th centuries. This fellow is named Wilhelm de Wette. in the 19th century especially. His contribution to source criticism is the discovery of Deuteronomy. You didn't know that Deuteronomy had to be discovered, but it was discovered by Wilhelm de Wette. Deuteronomy was discovered as D. So, you know these sources already. I think you have been introduced to them. J, have you heard of? Okay, so there's J and E. J stands for Yahwist. Okay. Germans use a J for Yahweh, so Yahwist. And Elohist. For de Wette, D is Deuteronomy. And there's also P, which is the priestly source. Anyway, so for de Wette, D is not so much the product of Moses as it is a composition that dates from the time of King Josiah. I think you can read about King Josiah in 2 Kings 23, 24, 22. 2 Kings chapter 22. Josiah and his priests, the people in his court, they discover the book of the law, it says, in 2 Kings 22. And de Wette says, well, when it says that they discovered the book of the law, the text that they actually are describing, talking about, is none other than the book of Deuteronomy. Okay? That's his theory. And for de Wette, not only have they discovered it, but they're actually putting together and crystallizing and confirming the material that would become Deuteronomy in the 7th century BCE. Okay. So this is an innovation for understanding the way that the Pentateuch comes together. De Wette's suggestion that Deuteronomy is a product of around the end of the 7th century, which is 600s. Okay. You guys have any questions so far? We're going through.
Within each source, are there various types of authors within it? Or is it just one person writing J source, or one person writing E source?
Great question. Great question. And I think depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers. So people, as a convention, as a scholarly convention, they tend to refer to, quote, the Yahwist, or the Deuteronomist, or the Yellowist, or something. Probably there are multiple hands involved in all of these sources. Probably. But to be honest, it's hard to really answer. I'm not for sure. Good question. Okay. Source criticism really reaches its zenith, I would say, in the 19th century with this fellow. His name is Julius Wellhausen. I don't think his name is spelled. Oh, there it is. I don't think you can see that. Wellhausen, W-E-L-L-H-A-U-S-E-N. And Julius Wellhausen is not responsible for coming up with these letters, these different sources. They were already offered and suggested by scholars who came before him. But Wellhausen does get credit for synthesizing these sources, for putting them together in offering some kind of a description of the relationship between the sources and how they develop. So Wellhausen is given credit for the so-called documentary hypothesis, the idea that the Pentateuch is the product of all these various sources, these four sources. That's his suggestion that it came into being in the way that he described in this particular order. J first, and then E, and then D, and then P last. Okay.
You didn't say anything about this too much in the last section, but I wonder if you would say something. You have on the side over there, evolution of Israelite religion.
Yes.
I've gotten the impression, I don't know this very well, but wasn't Wellhausen kind of, does he think that the priestly source is like a a later, worse form of Judaism?
That's right.
Talk to
yeah.
us about that.
Yeah,
Talk to
thank
us
you.
about-
Yeah, and so I also in the last section did talk about P.'s reputation
Yeah.
as being sort of self-interested, but maybe we'll have time for that now. I don't know. But yeah, that's right. So one of the ways that Wellhausen has been criticized, I think rightly criticized, is for his theory of the development of these sources and his understanding of the evolution of the Israelites' religion. So, in keeping with his synthesis of these sources, Wellhausen understands that the earliest form of Israel's religion, represented by J, is really the purest and the best. Right here, J presents a deity. J presents God as walking and talking with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and they have this intimate relationship. Everything is sort of natural and pure. And then, as these other layers of texts and traditions of the other sources come to contribute to the composition of the Torah, things take a turn. The Israelite religion goes down and is defiled in some sense. Maybe this is Wellhausen's Protestant bias could be having an influence here. He thinks that by the time you get to the priestly source, P, religion has been hijacked by the priests who are orchestrating this convoluted and complex liturgical cult, and their sacrifices, and their specific detailed rules about how the religion should function and operate. And for Wellhausen, this is not as pure a form of religion as the one that's presented by J, where Adam and Eve are walking with God, and everything, and God relates to humans in this very intimate, easy, personal way. There may be sort of an anti-Semitic bent also in Wellhausen's formulation of Israelite religion. So that part of his theory has been criticized, I think rightly, but Wellhausen's formulation of the documentary hypothesis JEDP has largely survived up until the present time. It's not universally embraced nowadays. There's, especially in European scholarship of the Bible, they tend to think of the Torah, the Pentateuch, as evolving and developing in a different way. They think that the Bible is constantly, all the time, being edited and revised, every single verse, not really in a way that is ascribed to these discrete sources. But in general, there's a very big circle of scholars, especially in North America, who still embrace, on some level, what Wellhausen has done with his synthesis of the documentary hypothesis. Did I miss anything? Guys, have any comments or questions? Please.
So does translation affect the sources? The translation of the Bible, so there's various types of translation.
What about translations?
So you know how like there's various translations.
Yeah.
So like each book will be affected by its meaning based on the translation. Is there like a universal meaning of each source that's not dependent on translation?
Well, you keep using the word translation,
So
and that I think that the concept of translating is maybe sort of a different question. I want to make sure we're on the same page. So we're right. So there are different English translations, or Spanish translations, or French, or German, or whatever. The Bible is first translated into Aramaic or Greek. We're talking. So this is to do with composition, and so these sources are working in Hebrew across the board. J is Hebrew.
okay.
E is Hebrew. D is Hebrew.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that help?
But it's baselines.
Hebrew. Yeah.
So the transition.
Yeah, and then they'll be translated later in different ways. Source critics think that these different traditions, though, have their own theologies. And that's something I want to talk about a little bit more soon. That these different sources have their own ways of representing God, representing the way God relates to humans. Right? That's something that you get, I think, from studying the source independently than you might from reading the Bible all sort of jumbled up as a level flat text. Okay. Someone in the last section was asking, what about geography? What does geography have to do with the development of these sources? Or how does this all work? This is a map of Israel at a particular moment. This is sort of a snapshot of Israel and Israel's map in a particular moment in time. This represents Israel after approximately the year 922 BCE. So you guys understand that Israel was governed by King David as a sort of nation state. And then the son of David was Solomon. Probably haven't gone to that yet in the semester. Maybe that'll come later on. When we get it later on in the semester, we'll talk about David and Solomon. But after Solomon, something bad happens. The nation-state of Israel gets divided into two. So there becomes, after 922 BCE, there becomes a northern state of Israel and a southern state of Judah. Okay, so that's reflected here. This pink is the northern kingdom of Israel. And then in the blue is the southern kingdom of Judah. All right, so they're divided after 922 BCE. And I'm trying to help you think through how these sources came to be incorporated into the Torah, how they got put together. Okay. Source critics think that the J source, it should be attributed to the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay. So there are traditions about the patriarchs. There are traditions about creation. There are traditions about Cain and Abel and the flood that were owned, that were told and retold and reshaped perhaps by the people who lived in Judah. But there were also stories and traditions and versions of those same oral stories that were circulating in the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, so all these different pockets of peoples have their versions, have their stories about patriarchs and Genesis and creation. Does that make sense? Right. Then, in the year 722, something catastrophic happens. The northern kingdom of Israel, all of this pink, is taken over by the enemy people, the Assyrians. If you know the story of Jonah at all, then maybe you're familiar with Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. The Assyrians take control of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE. And they send into exile all the northern kingdom of Israel. Well, what happens is, a lot of the people see that Assyria is coming before it happens, and they're able to escape the northern kingdom, and they flee to Judah as refugees. And they bring with them into Judah their versions of the stories, the patriarchs. Their versions of the stories of the flood, of creation, of Adam and Eve, of Cain and Abel, and so on. So now you have, after 722 BC, you've got these stories about the patriarchs in Genesis from the north and from the south, all circulating here in this concentrated region of Judah. And then when Judah goes into exile in 586, this will probably come along later in the semester too on that, all of this material gets consolidated, stitched together, put together into some kind of form that would be recognizable as the Pentateuch or as the Torah, as we would understand it now.
Just
here. And this is called the West Bank over here. All of this is Jordan, pretty much.
Country of Jordan.
The country of Jordan, that's right. And up here you've got Lebanon and Syria, which are in the news a lot nowadays. You still have Egypt down here. What else to say? There's Ashdod and Gaza here. This is still considered under Palestinian control, the Gaza Strip right here. Ashkelon is not on this map, but it's right about there. So here's a little bit of Palestinian-controlled territory, West Bank, and yeah, it's hard to. I should put a map on. Are you back on? Okay, so all of this leads us into what I want to introduce to you as the so-called historical critical method. Source criticism is one of the ways of reconstructing Israel's past, of reconstructing the composition of the Bible, and understanding the context in which the Bible is written. This is one of the tools of a broader category of inquiry that you can call the historical critical method. So I'm taking this definition of the historical critical method from the glossary of the New Oxford Annotated Bible, which is a study Bible put out by Oxford University Press. It says that the historical critical method is interpreting a text by trying to understand its original setting, its original audience, what it would have meant when it was originally written or spoken. This method uses the tools of historical research to understand the conditions of the past. Critical tools understand the traditions and developments that lie behind the surface of the text. So when we open the Bible, we have the surface of the text and we can read it this way. But modern scholars are trying to go underneath the surface of the text. We're trying to look behind what lies on the pages. We're trying to understand what are the traditions that sort of undergird, that tell the story of how the Bible came to be. A lot of people find this threatening. A lot of people find source criticism to be a challenge to faith. Why do you think it can be a challenge? What do you think? Do any of you feel a little bit threatened by source criticism, or the idea that the Pentateuch comes from these various sources or sources like them, rather than, let's say, the hand of Moses?
When I was in theology class, they said that when you challenge, when you want concrete evidence, it you start to distrust faith a little bit. I don't know if that helps with this idea of threatening tradition, or threatening what was going on, but this idea of wanting pure evidence over what someone has told you prior to that.
So it's a lot more comfortable, isn't it? I find it to be more comfortable to think, okay, this is what God told to Moses on Mount Sinai, and that's the end of the story. Right? It's maybe more comfortable to think of it that way than, okay, here are traditions, sometimes competing traditions that they put together later on in another time period. It's a little bit more uncertain. I see a couple of their hands. Go ahead.
I don't know if it's easier. It's better to think that something divine wrote it than somebody like you or me, like a regular person wrote it, who heard it and wrote it down.
No disrespect, but if I think this comes from God, I'm going to give it more weight than our names.
I'm Jess.
Jess seems like a lovely, wonderful person, but I'm going to give more credence to something that comes directly and only from the hand of God.
In the 8 a.m. class this morning, I kind of brought up, because you're talking about the story of Hagar and Ishmael, and why that story might be in the Bible in the first place, because it's so it's a hard concept, I guess, with the abuse and all that. So I guess it's hard for me to think, because obviously I grew up believing, and I still believe that the scripture is divinely inspired, but it's hard to believe that some of these human error stories are in it, and what their meaning kind of is. So again, kind of the whole your faith might be tested if you think about all these other sources kind of coming together, not exactly from divine. Yeah.
This is more complicated. Absolutely, this is more complicated and a little bit more difficult to put our minds around. The idea that God reveals Himself through human hands, that God works in partnership with humans when he gives us scripture, that flawed people like you and me and Jess can have a hand in the divine revelation. It's a little bit more threatening. It's a little bit more threatening. Anybody else have a comment about that? So the historical critical method is what characterizes really, I think, modern biblical scholarship. Right? Modern biblical scholars are trying to interpret the text, understanding its original setting and audience, what it would have meant when it was originally written or spoken. And in the context of source criticism, this is a big part of it. What were the original sources doing when they composed these materials? Right? What did they have in mind? How did they intend to portray God? Okay, so the historical critical method is historical in the sense that it is acknowledging that the Bible reflects its own historical context. This is really very much getting back to what Hobbes and Spinoza said, that the Bible has a historical context. It's rooted in a particular place, a particular time, and it's addressed to a particular people. It's critical in the sense that it's applying the same wide-ranging methods of inquiry to the Bible as one would to any other historical document. It's treating the Bible as if it were a historical document, or acknowledging, recognizing that it is a historical document, and then we can apply the same methods and tools of inquiry that we would to some unranging document. So now I want to transition to actually talking a little bit about the Abrahamic Covenant. There are two versions. There's Genesis 15, which is thought to be J. There's also Genesis 17, which is thought to be P. It's thought to come from a priestly source. So in the J presentation of the Abrahamic Covenant, God makes this promise to Abram and says, you are going to have all these descendants. And Abram famously believes God, and it says this is reckoned to him as righteousness, which Paul picks up later on. And then God also says to Abram, look, I'm going to give you land. And I think it's funny that Abram, who just, it says that he believed God, in the very next paragraph, very next line, has trouble believing that God's going to give him land. How will I know that I'm going to have this land? And God says, well, take these animals. And so Abram takes the animals, he cuts them in two, and this flaming torch goes between the animals. And this is God's promise to Abram that he's going to have this land. And that's the J version of the Abrahamic Covenant. Then you have the Genesis 17 version, the priestly source. And this is where God tells Abraham to circumcise himself and all his descendants. He is going to become the father of a multitude of nations. And he's going to have a son, not only Ishmael, but also Isaac. And Isaac will be the one to whom the covenant develops. Okay. So there are various ways in which the covenant of P, Genesis 17, I think is reworking, reshaping the story of Abraham's covenant in J, Genesis 15. So I think that historically, the J story came first, and then P was aware of the J story, and is rewriting, is reshaping this Abrahamic covenant in light of P's own theology, reworking, reshaping what the material that he already had to work with, which was the J presentation. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about here briefly, just a few comments. For one thing, there is a fertility blessing that's given to Ishmael in Genesis 17. God says that Ishmael is going to become the father of a great nation, that he's going to have offspring, he's going to have these 12 chieftains or princes that come from Ishmael. But God doesn't say anything about land or the promise to be God to Ishmael's people, as he does for Abraham. So that's a different kind of reshaping, I think, of the fertility blessing. the thing that is completely different about the Genesis 17 version of the story compared to J is that Hagar never runs away. Ishmael never runs away in Genesis 17, in the P version of this story. The way Hagar runs away, Ishmael is excluded in Genesis 16 or Genesis 21. Right? In Genesis 16, Hagar has to flee. She's pregnant. She has to flee because Sarah's oppressing her. In Genesis 21, Hagar and Ishmael are invited to leave the family of Abraham. And none of that happens in P's version. None of that happens in P's version. In fact, in Genesis 25, Abraham dies, and Ishmael and Isaac together cooperate in burying their father. So Ishmael is still in the picture in P's version. There is parallel fertility language between Ishmael and Abraham. God says that Abraham is going to become the ancestor of a multitude of nations, very numerous, and in Ishmael it says the same thing about him. That makes me pause. Right? That makes me pause. How do we explain? This is a datum point that we need to explain. We need a theory that can account for the blessing of Ishmael having all of these descendants. And an account that is supposed to be about the particular election of Abraham and his son Isaac. So how do you account for Ishmael having this blessing of fertility in a story that really centers around the particular singling out of Abraham? I'm curious, what do you think about this? Just what do you think about this?
The stories could have gotten confused. Like if it wasn't written down as soon as it was heard. Like, so I got two sisters. I tell one of them something and the other one will hear something completely different through the first one. So just something like that.
So like telephone?
Yeah.
Telephone game? The message gets confused? No, I don't know. I think P is very intentionally. I don't think it's like telephone. I think P is very intentionally showing that Ishmael is blessed. Ishmael is going to have all these offspring. This is reflecting the theology, the way of thinking about God, and the way he relates to humans. In P, there's a different version of the Abrahamic Covenant in P compared to J. Okay. What does it say to us? That Ishmael is going to be very fertile, he's going to have all these offspring. In the Abrahamic Covenant that is specifically for Abraham. Right? How do you count this? What do you think he is trying to communicate?
Maybe he is trying to communicate what an earlier author was trying to communicate about Cain in the story of Cain and Abel.
That he's not elect, or
Yeah, but that God still talks to him and wants to help him and wants to keep the relationship going.
very good. And so sometimes we're supposed to read Joel Kaminsky. Did you read a chapter from Joel Kaminsky? Kaminsky talks about levels of election. It's not this binary choice. It's not either or. You're not, in the Bible, Kaminsky argues, you're not either in or out. That's not the way election works. According to Kaminsky, he says that there are degrees of election. Some person can be elect and someone else is non-elect, and then another person might be anti-elect, might be actually working against the purposes of God. So you can have these various levels. So maybe Cain and Ishmael, even if they're not elect, God still has concern, care, compassion.
On the topic of election, do Jewish people still believe in like a sort of election nowadays, like in modern times? Like, is there still a like that kind of topic brought out?
Absolutely, that's important in Judaism. The idea that Jews are God's chosen people, that we circumcise other males at least in order to be identified in this community. Yeah, election is very much alive.
It's like still a part. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Another thing that's different is there's an emphasis on life, I think, in P compared to J and E. I think this goes along with the threatening expulsions that we talked about earlier. J has Hagar and Ishmael, or Hagar at least, who's pregnant, running away from Sarah. Her life is in jeopardy in J, and also in E, Hagar and Ishmael are cast out into the wilderness to face death, basically. Right? In P, there's an emphasis on life that Ishmael is blessed. He's going to be numerous. He's going to be fertile. I think that's pretty different from the way that the story unfolds in the other versions. It's pretty different. P has Abraham as the father of a multitude of nations instead of just a single nation. That's different. In J, God promises Abraham to be father of a great nation. In P, he's the father of a multitude of nations. That's why his name gets changed from Abram to Abraham, because he's the father of a multitude of nations. That's another important difference. Okay. In a moment, I'm going to invite you to reflect. Maybe I'll just give you some fair warning. In a moment, I want to invite you to reflect on how it affects the way we read the Bible to think in terms of these different sources. All right. So if it's true, if there are these different sources, P, J, E, and if each one of these sources represents its own presentation of God, its own way of thinking about God and the way God relates to us, how does it affect the way we read Scripture as Scripture? As compared to reading it sort of flatly as all one monolithic text. Does it affect the way we read Scripture? That's something I would invite you to reflect on and ponder. Is there a difference in the way we read the Bible devotionally? Does it affect the way we understand Scripture? To think of it in terms of sources as opposed to not reading the sources. All right. This is another a separate question altogether. I want to transition away for a minute from the Abrahamic Covenant in particular, and I want to say a little bit more about the personality profile of P. I want to think about what kind of a theology P puts forth. Okay. P, as I say earlier, has this reputation as being, it's sort of negative, honestly. P has traditionally sort of a negative reputation. I think it might come from Julius Wellhausen and his understanding of Israelite religion that sort of devolves into this highly regulated cult that the priests operate. So P has this reputation in scholarship. Not all scholars feel this way, but in general, P has had this reputation for being self-interested, for promoting the interests of priests. Okay, that's the reputation. So there are so many different cultic regulations in Leviticus. There are many concerns for the way priests ought to be treated. Right? You should give priests this much tithe. They should have this kind of allotment. You should take care of the priests. Right? It's Leviticus. Wellhausen's theory of the evolution of his religion. I think that P, on the contrary, has very much this universal and broad outlook. So, for example, some of the main texts in the priestly source are Genesis 1, and Genesis 9, and Genesis 17. Genesis 1 says, in verse 26, "Let us make humanity or humankind in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over the cattle." God created humankind in His image, male and female He created. Okay, so I think that's the very opposite of a self-interested portrayal of P. Right? On the contrary, P thinks that God has given all of humanity His own image. He's invested all of humanity, even women, male and female, in His own image. P here is playing off of an ancient idea that kings, in particular, are representing the image of the deity. It's the way that it worked in the ancient world. The king reflects the deity and functions as the deity's sort of vice regent on earth. Here in Genesis, you have the radical idea, in P especially, this radical idea that God has invested all of humans, universally with his image and have given them the job of representing God on the earth. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion of efficiency. So whereas ancient kings were thought to be the rulers instead of the deity, here in Genesis, all humanity has that job. So I think P has this universal scope in Genesis 1. Also in Genesis 9, after the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah right after the flood. They come out of the ark, and God makes a covenant. It says in verse 6, God says, in his own image, God made humankind. Once again, be fruitful, multiply, abound on the earth, multiply. God said to Noah, as for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your sons, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, every animal of the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant I made with you and every living creature. So in Genesis 9, it's not only all humans, male and female, but even the animals. Universally, all creation, God is making this covenant. So the scope of the way God relates in Genesis 9 is very broad, not just one race. And that brings us ultimately to Genesis 17, this Abrahamic Covenant. Notice that the male representatives of Abraham's household are supposed to be circumcised. Not just Abraham and Isaac, but it says, every male among you shall be circumcised when he's 8 days old, including the slave born in your house, the one bought with your money. Both the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money must be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. So everybody's supposed to be circumcised. And then in verse 23, later on, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all the slaves born in his house and bought with his money. Every male among the men of Abraham's house, he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins. Elsewhere it says, anybody who doesn't get circumcised is breaking my covenant. Even if you're not a descendant of Abraham, just any male in the household who doesn't get circumcised is breaking the covenant. So it's possible to break the covenant even if you're not an offspring of Isaac, or you're just somebody who's in the household. So that says to me that P has this universal kind of way of thinking about humans. Even when the covenant is narrowed down to Abraham, and just Abraham and his son Isaac, these chosen, elect representatives of the household of Abraham. Here in P, we have this allowance, this concern that all the male members of the house will represent the covenant. They'll all receive these honors. So I think that's a difference between J's account of the covenant and P's. Significantly, here in Genesis 17, verse 8, this is the Abrahamic covenant. This is where God tells Abraham that his covenant will be with Isaac. Significantly here in verse 8, it says, Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. God says, no, your wife Sarah shall bear his son, shall call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him. It will be an everlasting covenant. As for Ishmael, I've heard you, I will bless him, and I will make him fruitful and seemingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 princes. I'll make him a great nation. Does it make a difference to read Genesis 17 with a consciousness of its priestly origins? Does that make a difference to read it together with Genesis 1 and Genesis 9? We talk about this universal scope of God's concern. How does that affect the way we read Scripture, I guess? I think that's the question that really matters. It's one that I haven't fully answered for myself yet, but I think that's one that we all need to think about a little bit. What kind of difference does it make to read Scripture in light of these sources, as opposed to reading Scripture flatly? Understand what I'm saying?
The little discrepancies kind of start to make sense. Like when you see differences between wording in different sources, you can suddenly realize, like, oh, from this particular source, this is the lens you read it from, this is what it would mean in light of another source. So you can start to put them together to kind of compile them in your own readings of it.
right? So you can compile these differences, each one individually, to construct a profile of the various sources you're saying. How does that contribute to you when you understand God?
I think it's interesting that you can see him in so many different ways. So I'm not sure how that personally affects how I see God, but it's amazing to see how many ways he can speak to different people in the different texts. So seeing how like the literary significance of talking in humankind instead of just particulars, how inclusive that is, and how positive one source could be related to how negative another could be. It kind of ebbs and flows depending on like where you are spiritually. One might speak to you more.
Wonderful. So if it's true that you have these different traditions that are developing in different parts of Israel, maybe there's a tradition in the north, maybe there's a tradition in the south, maybe the priests have their own versions of these, or maybe they're putting these stories together in a new way. It reflects, as you say, doesn't it, various perspectives, all of them reflecting revelation. Nice. Someone else?
Yes, it also helps when you take into consideration when each of the sources were thought to come from, because then you can look at the historical context and see, oh, this is written this way because this was happening at this time to these specific people. And so if you read it that way, you can tell, like, okay, they wrote it this way, like, and that makes a lot more sense knowing what was happening in the world around them.
Great. Can you give it? Do you have any examples? You spoke so well of this.
Yeah,
it sounds like you're familiar with source criticism. Can you give some other examples?
I took a scripture class in high school, and I just remember like certain time periods where like there was like more positivity and the people were being treated like better, or there were wars going on, and you could tell based on the language that was being used, or like if there was like an exile. I'm pretty sure that also affected like the words that were being used and how the stories were portrayed differently. But I can't remember like a lot of the specifics. It was a couple years ago.
Yeah, great. So, for example, if people think that the exile really figures prominently in a lot of these stories, right? So, for example, if the J source is the one that's talking about the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 2, what happens to Adam and Eve after they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What happens to them as a punishment? What is it?
They're kicked out of the garden.
They're kicked out of the garden. They're kicked out of the land. So some modern scholars take that as a metaphor for the people of Israel who find themselves in exile as a consequence for their breaking of the covenant. So that story of Adam and Eve is can be read as a microcosm of the experience of Israel as a whole. When they sin, they break the covenant, they're sent out of the land. What do you think? Is there a benefit of reading? So I'm using these fancy words, synchronic and diachronic. Synchronic means reading a text all at once, as if it were from the same time. Which is to say, we open up the pages of the Bible and we can read these stories, Genesis 15, 16, 17, 18, as if they came from the same hand who sat down and wrote them in an afternoon. Right? That's a synchronic reading. The diachronic reading is when you're sensitive to the sources. The diachronic reading is when you're sensitive to the history of the composition, and you realize there's a history of the way this text came to be. And you see, oh, there are certain characteristics of this source, other characteristics of that source. So these are two very different ways of reading the Bible. Most of us intuitively read the Bible synchronically, don't we? But I'm trying to demonstrate for you a way of reading it diachronically also. It's also possible to read it diachronically. And the question that I'm trying to put out there is, what kind of a difference does it make if you read it synchronically versus diachronically? Can reading it diachronically help?
I think diachronically, at least for me, would make it seem more real. Because when I'm just reading it kind of synchronically, I'm just like, okay, it kind of feels like let's just say story of Genesis, like, oh, I know it happened, but like it almost seems more like fanciful, kind of like, oh, it's a story kind of thing. But when you're reading it diachronically, you kind of actually have to think about what you're reading, and like you kind of see the different perspectives, and you're like, oh, this actually happened. Like this is more like humanly real, possible. Does that make sense? Like.
Along the same lines, I was first introduced to the idea of sources last year in Dr. Harmon's class, and for me personally, it made it less of a story and more of a history, and even if it's not like historical in the way that modern historians would think of it, it still makes it more real in my mind, and as somebody who studies history, that really like matters a lot to me. And so it's less this thing that this book says, and this like, here's why it says this, and here's the context that it says that, and that really helps to solidify a lot of the ideas for me personally.
That's so helpful the way you put that. I like that. You talked about its use for history, right? It was actually Spinoza who said, this is not the stuff of history, but it's stuff for history. It's not the stuff of history, but stuff for history. It's a way of understanding the past. These are sources that help us understand the past, rather than representing blow by blow, play for play, how things went down necessarily. Nice. I was talking to someone else who had a very educated opinion on this question after the last section. Your professor suggested, well, maybe this is like getting to know someone's story, right? If you're getting to know someone, maybe you go on a date, I don't know, and you're getting to know that other person, you ask about their family history, tell me about your parents or your brothers and sisters. It's a way of getting some background information on a person. And if you think about Revelation in that way, this is like getting to know the story of the Bible itself. What is the story of the Bible? How does the Bible come to be? And what is Scripture? It's a way of treating the Bible with respect and treating it with, I think, a zeal to get to know it. Right? To be intimately acquainted with Revelation. It's another way to get under the surface of the text to really understand. Any other thoughts here? I have one or two other ideas that I wouldn't mind floating past you. Not to do with P, but to do with the story of Hagar. If you'll indulge me, I can get to this. When I study the story of Hagar and Ishmael, this is something that I find to be very fascinating. I think that Phyllis Tribble picks up on this a little bit. You guys read Text of Terror, I think? I think this is so remarkable. It says that in Genesis 15, at the end of this covenant that God makes with Abram, in Genesis 13, it says, then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain your descendants will reside as aliens in a land not their own, where they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. And here the term that they use for alien is actually, in Hebrew, is actually singular. It's actually ger, in the singular. Okay? Know for certain your offspring, your descendants will be an alien in a land not their own. They shall be enslaved and oppressed. Here it says for 400 years. I will bring judgment on the nation they serve, and after this they will go out with great wealth. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace, will be buried by the age. Your descendants will return here to the witness of the Amorites. I think that the meaning, the interpretation of this little prophetic announcement to Abram is about Israel, right? Israel is going to be oppressed. His descendants are going to be oppressed in Egypt all this time. And then ultimately they'll come back and the land of Canaan. But I think there's also a secondary reading think there's another level in which this can be interpreted and read. If you put the definite article in front of "der" to make it say "the alien," at least, then you get the name of Hagar. Hagar's name has the same consonants as the alien. The alien. Is that intentional? I think so. I can't prove it. I think it might be intentional. Hagar also, just like the Israelites, is oppressed. And in fact, the same verb is used in Genesis 16 about the way Sarah treats Hagar. She is oppressing Hagar. The very same verb is used as in this prediction in Genesis 13. And I also think that there is a judgment that comes on the nation whom she serves. What is the nation whom Hagar serves? Israel, or the ancestors of Israel, at least, right? Abraham, Sarah. And so Abraham and Sarah have offspring through Isaac, and then Jacob, and then the sons of Jacob include Joseph. And where does Joseph end up? Joseph ends up in Egypt. And how does he get to Egypt? He's sold to the Ishmaelites. He's sold to the Ishmaelites are the ones who serve as the merchants who trade Joseph, who traffic Joseph into slavery in Egypt. So there's a kind of, I think there's a sort of retributive cycle that happens here with the Hagar-Ishmael story. That Abraham and Sarah mistreat Hagar, or oppress Hagar, where's Hagar from again? You know her nationality? She's an Egyptian. So Hagar is an Egyptian slave who gets oppressed by the Israelites. And then it comes around again, sort of like karma, it comes around again to the Israelites who end up as slaves in Egypt. Okay? So all of this is a way of saying, in my takeaway from Hagar and Ishmael, if we're trying to answer the question, why does the Bible give so much attention to Hagar and Ishmael? If that's the data that we're trying to think about, in my opinion, one of the main reasons why Hagar and Ishmael get so much attention is because as the covenant is narrowing down in its focus to just Abraham, the elect. Abraham is the chosen, he's the elect. Then God is also, through Hagar and Ishmael, God is also saying, I love them too. I care about them too. They're my people in some sense also, even if they're not the elect of this covenant. Even if they're not chosen, I'm still going to make Ishmael a great people. I'm going to make him a great nation. I still care about Hagar enough to visit her when she's in the wilderness. And Hagar feels this concern, this care from God, so much so that she names, as your professor mentioned in the class, she names God El-Roi, God who sees me. You are God who sees me. And God has Hagar name her son Ishmael, which means God hears. Which means God hears. Right? That's the great story of Hagar and Ishmael. You may find, and I think it has resonance for all of us. You may find yourself in a situation, in a position, like Cain, where your sacrifice is not favored, where you seem to get the short end of the stick. Every time again. That might be a scenario that you can identify with, where someone else has it a little better than you do. But the beauty of this Hagar-Ishmael story is that God is attuned. His sensory perception is alive and is aware of Hagar's situation. She names her son Ishmael. God hears. And she names God, you are God who sees. God understands and cares, and he has compassion for everybody, not just those who are elected.
Let's thank